Okay, good morning. So we're up to Shin Chavdala. We'll try and finish off Shin Chavdala today. The Mechaber says in Sifches, Ein choischin shachas. You're not allowed to cut shachas. Pirush yerek shel tvua shenikza terem shenisbash lahatvua. It's some sort of crop, vegetables which have been harvested when they're not quite finished. They're still a bit unripe. And they cut them in order to give the animals. Bein daka, bein gasa. So you're not allowed to cut shachas to give to the animals. Bein daka, bein gasa, whether in thin or thick pieces. Mishum de beloy chituch nami chaz lachila, because without chituch they're actually edible by the animals, and therefore it's unnecessary for you to do it. So, which is the rule we had last time. Says the Mishnah Berurah Chof Beis, va'afilu chatichas gedolas delesba mishum tchina. Even larger pieces, and there's no problem with tchina, you're not allowed to do it because it's just not necessary. The animals can eat themselves. The belay chituch, that without cutting it, the animals can do it themselves, and therefore it's unnecessary for you to do it. Mukach mized the mairi berakin. We're clearly talking about soft food. Aval b'charuvin, but if it's very hard, kosh b'charuvin koshin, if it's hard animal fodder, she'enim ruim bilti chituch, with the animals would not be able to eat it without you cutting it, then that's okay. Muta to bichlal shivui uchluhu, because it makes it into food, and therefore you're facilitating their eating, and that's okay. V'kol zeh b'chatichas gedolos katzas, and then only then it's with slightly larger pieces, avol dakas. But if it's very small pieces, also mishum chashash tchina, then we get back to the old problem of tchina. If it's not somach lesuda, if it's not straight away, you cut small pieces for later, that would not be allowed. Okay.
So if you cutting very, very, very small things.
It's a problem with tchina.
Just before you eat
that's okay, yeah.
That is okay.
Yeah. Tess. Now, ein oivsin es hagamol. Maybe you remember all these from Mishnais and Shabbos. It's ein oivsin es hagamol. You're not allowed to force feed the gomel. What does that mean? Dahanu shemachina biyad kol kach, that you give it so much food, ad shemarchivin b'nei me'er be'ovos, that you widen the stomach of the animal, v'loy darsin, and dahainu shederz lemachal b'groinei lemokum she'eni yochel achzir. You put the food in the mouth or in the throat of the animal, she'eni yochel achzir, that you won't be able to sort of bring it back out. You're worried the animal's not going to eat properly. So it's a way of making sure your animal eats properly. You actually put it down the throat of the animal. Avol malitin, avol malitin, but you are allowed to do malitin. What is that? We'll see soon. Ein mamorim es hagolim avol malitin. You can't do mamora for calves, but you can do malitin. Says the Gemara, says the Mechaber, Eizu hamra. What is hamra? Hamra lemokum she'en yochel lachzeh. That you put it so far down the throat of the animal that it can't sort of regurgitate it. It's going to make sure it will certainly eat it. Halata, however, is lemokum she'yochel lachzeh. You only put it sort of less far down, and therefore it could sort of bring up that food. V'din tanagolim v'avozim kedin agolim, and tanagolim and avozim, chickens and geese, they have the same din as agolim. Okay, let's see the Mishnah Berurah for a bit more detail. Ein oivsin. So says the Mishnah Berurah, kol choftar, it's kol zeh mishum tirchi yaseira. Whatever, all the prohibitions over here is because it's unnecessary tircha on Shabbos, and therefore you can't do it. So then we said v'lo dorsin, you can't force the food into the throat of the animal to a place she'en yochel achziroi. Says the Mishnah Berurah Chafei, she'toichiv lo lifnim bebeis habliya. You put it down quite far down the food pipe. Lemokum she'ena, to a place where you can't bring it back up. Umashim b'gemara v'duchol she'ena marbit es apehema. Whenever the animal is not sort of crouching down, squatting down, ein yochel litchev kol kach ba'emek. Then just technically you can't force the food down the throat of the animal, and therefore it's always considered, if the animal is not squatting, it's always considered a place where the animal will be able to bring the food back up. Again, you're doing this for the benefit of the animal, that it's making sure that it eats properly. Tarnagolim va'avozim, so we said they've got the same din as agolim. Dahainu, says the Mishnah Berurah of Zayin, she'also litchev b'greinim hamaychel, you're not allowed to put the food so far down their throat that you can't, they can't bring it back up, because again it's tirchi yaseira. Va'avozim shemafatzim oisom, and geese that you're trying to fatten up, and you use this feeding method during the week, and you can't do any other way, you're allowed to tell a non-Jewish person to do this procedure, but you only need to feed them once a day, that's enough. Even though ordinarily they would eat twice a day. That if there's no non-Jewish person around, that the hamra, this putting the food down the throat of the animal, was actually be allowed by a Jew, because otherwise the animal won't eat properly, and you're helping the animal eat. If you can't find a non-Jewish person to help you, then you try and do it by way of a cotton. Ad kan loshen hamogen Avram b'siman shinches sif cotton yud beis. Avol b'seifa el yirabe hechmir shelo lahamr salidei Yisrael. He is more machmir and says that you shouldn't get a Jewish person to do this feeding. Uchudas hamarshal ha'isa b'zeh, like the marshal who asks. V'chein ben sivchai machmir b'zeh. Achkach mososi b'meiri u'b'chidushi haran. Shenitfas mechodosh al Shabbos, that has been recently printed. Mashma gamkein daitem kadas ha'isrin va'ayin b'be halacha, that you shouldn't get Yisrael to do this feeding mechanism. Okay, good. Yud. Mutalitin machul b'fiyem shal tar negolim. You're allowed to put food into the mouth of the chicken on Shabbos. Hainu, says Mishbur Chavches, l'mokum shecholim lahachzir, to a place where it doesn't go so far down that the animal could bring the food up again. And this really is what the Ramah said in the previous sif. And it's a bit strange on the Ramah. What is he adding? Because the Mechaber says this halacha very clearly in the previous halacha. Maybe he's just clarifying the Mechaber, just sort of overlearning, it's called. When that which we allow you to feed the animal, to put it down so far to a place where it goes to a place where he actually is not so far that you can actually sort of regurgitate the food or bring it up again. You got to be careful not to touch the animal. Because animals are muksa. So how exactly you do it, I'm not sure, but you somehow put your hand into the mouth of the animal without holding on to the animal or touching it in some way. Okay, Yud Aleph. You're not allowed to put out water or other food in front of bees, nor doves in the dovecot, for yone aliyah or in the upper one, nor can you feed a chazir. You can put food out for your geese and for your chickens, for yone bayosos and domestic doves, and so too for your dog who's looking for you for food. You're responsible for feeding the animal, and that's the general rule. You can feed animals that are your responsibility, but not those which are not. So you can't put out food for bees and for what was the other one? Yonei Shovach, these doves. Now why not? Even if they're your animals, because because there's so much food around, it's not really there's no need for you to do it, and you just leave them to their own devices and they'll be fine. And therefore, if you go out and start feeding them, it's unnecessary. Interestingly, in 14, he makes two fascinating points. Number one, what if it's not your animal, but there's just not a lot of food around? So how does that work? So if you're kind to the animal and you want to put out some food because there's not allowed, even though they're not mezonos nolecha, but you feel that there's not a lot of food around, that would be allowed. Lo hifsid. Interesting. And then v'chein balichaim she'ein mezonos nolecha. So too animals which it's not your responsibility, they're not your animals. Let's say you have a dog or a cat that sort of comes up to your back door. It's not your animal, but you have you put out some milk for that cat. They don't go elsewhere. Even if you don't feed them, they'll be hungry. Amazing. So even though it's not your animal, if they're turning to you for food and you're rogil to give them and they don't get elsewhere, then that would seem to be allowed. Okay, sifkot and lamed. You're not allowed to put out food for a pig, for a chazir. The reason why it's not your responsibility is because you're not allowed to rear pigs, chazirim. If you happen to, that you owed money and the person paid you back by giving you chazerim, that was the only assets he had. Chazal allow you to take them in, so long as it's a short-term thing until he gives you a bit of time for you to sell them in the marketplace, and therefore till that time you've got to look after them. In that situation, it's mutter to give them food on Shabbos. And then, so too, you're allowed to give a kelev food. Mutter says, "V'chein," we said, "Lifnei kelev shemezonosov olecha." Says in Mishnah Lamed Aleph, "Va'afilu kelev she'einu megadol bebeis mutter." Even a kelev which is not in your house, it's a mitzvah. There is a dog in the area, the neighborhood. A dog you're allowed to give some food. Why is that? It's a mitzvah ksas gam nitin lo mezonos. It's a mitzvah ksas to give them some food. K'moshe amru Chazal shechos HaKadosh Baruch Hu alav lefi shemezonosov mu'otin, because the food available for dogs, roaming dogs, stray dogs, is not very plentiful. And dogs will hold on to the food for up to 3 days. Check out the Eli Rabbah. Lifnei kelev ra also. Lifnei chazir dasa. Kamoi lifnei chazir dasa. So just like you're not allowed to give food to a chazir because it's also legavle, also too a kelev ra, dangerous dog. There's also an issa to raise a dangerous dog, and therefore, since you're not allowed to raise it, it's not mazonos and olecha, and therefore you can't feed dangerous dogs or chazirim. Mishum de'is legadol chazirim v'kelev ra. Yesh nagim litin chitin ifnei oifes b'Shabbos shir. There is this minhag to put out some bread for birds on Shabbos shir. We spoke about this a while ago. Ve'ein the nochem, but it's not correct, says the Mishnah Berurah. Shahari ein mazonos and olecha. That's the rule. These are not your animals. They're just some birds that are going to come to your garden, and therefore you can't do it. So they are the Stipe and others. They used to do it Erev Shabbos Shira or Motzei Shabbos Shira or whatever. They wouldn't do it on the Shabbos itself. Yud Beis. Mutzah lehachil telas hameshi. You're allowed to feed a silkworm on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah Lamed Beis. Lahachil lefi shemezonos alecha, because they are your responsibility. She'en l'mayecha, because they haven't got any other food. Ki im mashanoson leheodam, other than that which people will give them. V'domi la'avozim v'tanagolim, and to that extent, they're like avozim v'tanagolim, and therefore they turn to you for food. V'tiltil heim asurin kashar b'alechaim, but you can't, be careful not to touch them, should you ever want to. Yud Gimel. Ma'amid muktzah. Ma'amid adam behemdei al gabi asovim. This is also a Mishnah there in Shabbos. You're allowed to stand your animal on asovim mechubarim. And we're not worried you're going to come to do tlisha. You'll come and detach the grass to feed your animal, because you know that tlisha is also on Shabbos. But you can't stand your animal on muktzah crop and fodder, because that you'll treat a bit more leniently, and the temptation is to take some of the muktzah food and give it to your animal. And the issa is dafka to put them on muktzah things. That's where there'll be the temptation, because you're so close to the muktzah, you might come to feed the animal. But if you're standing in such a way that the animal can go itself and you're not sort of directly next to the muktzah things, that would be allowed. Says the Mishnah Berurah Lamed Gimel, Ma'amid adam behemtei te'isv mechilta leman yonuach. Maybe you shouldn't allow your animal to graze on Shabbos at all. The animal's got to rest. It's a distress for the animal not to graze, and therefore you're allowed to let your animal stay in the field on Shabbos. You have to bring him into the barn and lock him up. You're not worried. You can stand on the field and you can stand next to it. You're not worried that you may come and be toilesh. However, on muksa you're not allowed to, unless the animal can get there himself. Kivin she'ein, says Mishmur Lamatei, Kivin she'ein korov lo kolkach lekel mechish, because you're not so close to the muksa, we're not worried about that. Let's just finish off quickly. Yud Daled. Noitlin Michael mifnei chamor If you've got a trough with your donkey's food in it, you're allowed to take it from the chamar's trough and give it to your shur, your ox. You can't do it the other way around. Because the food that the ox eats is quite disgusting. The saliva of the ox is plentiful and it goes all over the food, and therefore it's not going to be royal for the chamar. And some are makbid not to cross-feed animals if it's designated for one, not to give to the other one. Lamed Vav, v'noisen lifnei shar, she'ein hashar kotz b'meichel hanisha min hachamar, because the shar is not disgusted by leftovers of the donkey. She'ein matl reh, because the donkey doesn't emit a lot of saliva. V'ein royal oid lechamar, but the other way around it doesn't work, because the shar is a very sort of messy eater, and there'll be a lot of saliva over the food, and it's not roy for the chamar. Rak alidei adchak, only if there's mamish nothing else, if it's an extenuating situation of a matriach b'chinam, and therefore you're not allowed to do it because it's a tircha problem. If you would take from the trough of the shar to give it to the chamar, it's not roy for the chamar, and therefore there's been a tircha unnecessarily. For dafka lechamar she'en a minay hu kotz b'ma'cholim b'nei harir, dafka food where he's not going to eat it, he'll be disgusted by it because of the saliva. But to give from one ox to another ox, that would be okay. Because that ox, the second ox, is not worried about the rear. And to give to another animal, also we don't allow that. Because it's not just for donkeys that are disgusted by it, it could be other animals as well. And there are those who are noeg heter, you don't have to protest against them. Unless they really are disgusted by the saliva that comes out of the first animal. Okay, let's just do one final sif, finish off the simon. You're not allowed to sweep up the trough of a shir shel petem, even if it's in a kli and it's not on the ground. We're worried sweeping the trough. Imagine you've got like a barn, and you're on the ground, you've got like a corner there is the trough where you put all the food. If you start sweeping it, you might come to meshave gumos to flatten the earth. And they made a gezeira of an ovashel kli, even a sort of a kli one is a gezeira otu shel karka. However, you can't sort of move around, rearrange the food in the teven, the teven. I mean, to move it to the side. We'll see why in the Mishnah Berurah. It says in Mishnah Berurah Lamates ligroif. You sweep it. You want to get rid of the dirt and the bits of the teven and the soirim. You want to take the stones and the dirt away from the teven, but you got to be careful not to do it on Shabbos because you might count in Meshave Gumos. Says the Mishnah Mem also Meshave Gumos Hanu the Shom Regilus Shemechavin LaShovi Kadesh Leipal HaSoirim for Gumos, because if there are holes in the field, then the soirim might go into the ditches, and you don't want that. And therefore they ask that it's even in a trough which is in the kli. But if it's like a box or something and it's not a proper, a big proper kli, then that would seem to be okay. Mem Aleph. If you've got a lot of produce, you want to sort of move it around, because the shur, you don't want the shur to step in it with all his re'i, the excrement. And therefore it's all muktzah, it's all not royal, and therefore you shouldn't touch it. Okay, less relevant halachas today, one would think, but I suppose the stray animals and things like that, that's the general klal. An animal which is your responsibility, you're allowed to feed, and which is not, then you can't. But if it's a stray animal who turns to you, interestingly, there could be a terim.
The bread on Shabbos, you can't put it in the garden.
Yeah, so if you're just getting rid of you want to empty your tablecloth in the garden, that's okay.
Yes.
That would be okay, yeah.